I wanted to mention a little bit about my graduate school work. I got an MA in Anthropology and Linguistics. Now, linguistics was the minor, and there were two reasons, I think. One of them was that the man that recruited me into graduate school was a linguist. He was also a misanthropic man who was looking for new graduate students because he had a grant from the U.S. government to give fellowships to 3 graduate students a year, and he had failed them all out. So he expected a bit much, let's say. So he became my enemy, the linguist, and I took some courses, and I remember a morphology course where he said, do a morphological analysis of the good tall boy's ship sank. And I thought, oh. So I said, well, could I do this as the good tall boys sadly left? And he got very red in the face. And so I sadly left and went to a different advisor. So that's the sob story part. The really good part was that at that time, and at the recommendation of my enemy, the linguist, I read an essay by Edward Sapir called Culture, Genuine and Spurious. I was fascinated. Thanksgiving break was coming up, and I spent the weekend rereading this one little essay because I thought that there was something deep behind it. And I still think so. I wound up doing my master's thesis on Edward Sapir. And I wrote it, and more drafts and more drafts and more drafts over a period of nearly 3 years, which is very, very unwise from a university point of view, but was not so unwise because it then got published as the lead article in American Anthropologist. And the editor was very complimentary. He said, I wish that most articles I see were as well written as yours. It probably got me this job. And I still read Sapir. There's an optimism there, and there is a genius there. You can ask Regna Darnell when you record her, because she did a biography of Sapir. But I wrote a few things on Sapir, but I read a lot. And I tried to read beyond the words, behind the words. He was, I guess we could say, an optimist about anthropology, about linguistics, because he was a major figure there, and about social science in general as offering understanding, but also more than understanding, a contribution to the way societies function. And in that he was very optimistic, and perhaps it seems little justified from time to time, as in right now, but losing the optimism is a terrible mistake. That's just capitulation. Anyway, Sapir was very important and has been very important, and if I get a little discouraged with the way my work is going, I'll go back and read a little Sapir or a Cree story, and that gets me back up and pumping again. So the person that I went to for my new advisor was the man who had the grant for graduate student fieldwork training, John Honigman. John was sort of the opposite. John was helpful. John would listen to any half-brained idea I had and be interested, trying to look for what there was of value there. And he took me on as an advisee, and it was a kind of a hands-off thing. He would be helpful where he could be helpful, and he would just let me run with it otherwise. And so it was because of his permission I was able to go back to Waskaganish the second summer. And when I then applied to what was then the National Museum of Canada for a research grant so I could go back for the third summer, wound up going 7 summers in all, and then some brief winter trips, and then shorter ones later on, especially when I was asked to be a part of some project. And so I owe John Honigman, and I certainly owe John Blacknod. And I certainly owe Edward Sapir, because he has been an inspiration. And like many people who are somewhat ahead of the crowd, I guess, Sapir was criticized by his colleagues for writing too little. His collected works are now in 12 or 13 volumes, Ragnar can tell you. So that was wrong. And people were inclined to be a little bit sloppy in their interpretations of what he was saying, what he was intending, bending it in the direction of what they were saying and intending, using him as a supporting cast member. At any rate, those are the important characters in that period of my life, and still. Now, back to Waskaganish, the second summer. A man had moved there from a community of Nemaska, about 80 miles up the Rupert River, who had the reputation of being a conjurer. And various people wanted him to conjure, to make a public performance of what they call the shaking tent. And so he agreed, and he was encouraged in this by old John Blacknod, and indeed did it in front of John's house. And John gave me some introductory orientation, brought out an old wash tub, turned it upside down, told me to sit down there and put my tape recorder next to it. And I could hang the microphone almost like a snare outside the conjuring tent. And so I recorded a conjuring tent. Well, that more or less made my PhD dissertation because it's exotic. Truth be known, he wasn't a very good conjurer. But at that time, that was the only tape recording of a conjuring tent that existed in the world. Harvey Fite later did one at Waswanipi. And what we did afterwards was that I would play the tape of the conjuring tent until John gave me a signal. I'd click it off, and then John would explain, and then Woolley would translate what was going on. So we did it in rather short segments, and putting that together was the main chapter in the dissertation. And then we got into lots of stories about conjuring and about what I call a tending spirit, other people call a guardian spirit, that conjurers make use of, have a relationship with. And then I was going to go into Nemaska. The only way you could get there was to fly, and there were not scheduled flights there, but the Hudson's Bay Company would occasionally send a plane load of groceries or something like that up, and I could get on that. So Willie and I were going to go to Nemaska, and Willie got sick. And then he got more sick. And then he got so weak that he couldn't really get around, and I urged him to go to the nursing station. He said he didn't think he could make it, and I said, well, I'll go with you, and if you can't walk that far, I will carry you, because he's small. And we got him to the nursing station, and then the next day he died. And so I took that a little hard, and went down and told his sister what had happened, and she lived in the home of a man who became my interpreter, Anderson Jolly. And they were aggrieved to hear that Willie had died. They were sympathetic to me because they knew I was pretty upset. And they also lived fairly close to John Blacknad. And so after a few days, I hadn't gone out of my cabin. And John came with a young fellow who spoke English and told me a story. And the story was a kind of a classic called The Beaver Wife in English, although it's a much better story than that. In Cree, it's called The Boy Who Was Not Born Naturally. And I've written about that story a few times, and then recently, what I think is my best publication, gave the story with an interpretation of younger brother. Of course, they're the foolish ones, who winds up marrying a beaver because he doesn't really want to have a wife from humans. He's had a bad experience with humans, with a mother, in fact. So, at any rate, John picked, you could say, a plum to get me off my butt and out of the depression, and it worked. And later on, of course, we went over the transcript that I made from that on with a very good, well, Albert Diamond, actually, high school graduate. And I would read a little passage. John would put his finger on the page, and Albert would translate, and we'd go down the page. Now, go to the next page, John put his finger on the page again. It was sort of an endorsement. Yes, this is okay. He gave his approval in that sense. And so, at any rate, I got started again, this time with Anderson Jolly, my neighbor, as the interpreter. Anderson and John had been living next to each other, 100 yards maybe, for years, but they weren't particularly good friends. They were very different style. Anderson came from a company family, although an orphan, but worked for the company and was fluent in English. And Anderson and I became good friends. I remember once laying out in the grass on a nice summer day and swapping stories. He'd tell me a story, and then I'd try to remember movie plots. I told him the story of Samson and Delilah with Victor Mature and whoever the vamp was there. And it included little people, dwarves, who were tormenting Samson towards the end of the drama. And that got us into little people in the James Bay area, which was kind of interesting. Anyway, we swapped stories. And Anderson translated for several summers for me. The Conjuring was, in a way, a highlight of my professional career, but I'd have to say that I did not know what was going on. I could not understand a word of it. I was sitting there feeling like I was Malinowski, lacking a pith helmet, and utterly out of my element. But of course, John provided the translation afterwards. But it was an odd feeling. Well, I know this is really important. Well, it's a good thing I'm tape recording it. I was using a tape recorder that belonged to the evangelical minister there, who was not too pleased that I was using his machine to record this pagan ceremony. But he was afraid enough of the conjurer so that he didn't intervene. And so through all of this, I'm aware that I sound a little hapless. I was. I was also pretty intelligent. I don't want to just be self-effacing because it makes me sound like a silent picture clown, and I can picture one in my mind that the Crees would have loved if I could have shown some of those. I'm trying to think of his name now. Buster Keaton. Deadpan and sort of clueless, but always somehow managing, like Trickster, to emerge okay at the end. Anyway, that was important, and the stories are very important. And during the third summer there, I was recording stories again, 65. No, I had no tape recorder. I had no money. I had 3 kids by this time, and I couldn't borrow a tape recorder, so I missed recording that one summer. But at any rate, I was listening to the story and writing it down, of course. I wrote them down as well as tape recording when I had the tape recorder, because I could concentrate more. I wouldn't just sit there and think, well, I'm getting it on the recorder. I don't have to think, No, you have to concentrate. For one thing, John's watching my face. If I'm not concentrating, he's not going to... Okay. Part of the deal. Anyway, I would say to myself, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And then at one point, kind of a crucial point, an epiphany maybe, I was saying that makes sense as a visiting, budding intellectual. And I had this little rush of feeling afterwards, and it really does. It really does make sense. Okay, at that point, I understood what culture means. Okay, I'd made a transition. I'd got, not totally immersed, but I'd gotten my feet wet. And I realized more than I had before what was involved in these stories. Because these stories, in their incidentals, wind up informing each other. You get a whole corpus of stories, and it's like any other corpus of literature. If you want to read, I don't care, Dostoevsky, or each book informs another. You read Sapeur's essays, and you recognize the thinking behind them. Okay? Same with those stories. Now, John knew a lot of stories because John was a miser. He was not widely liked, but he was certainly respected for his knowledge. He was a miser, and that meant that stories that he heard from his grandmother as a little kid, he remembered. The reason he had all those stories was because they were part of his wealth. He also had 2 canoes that were beyond repair and one that worked, but he wasn't going to get rid of the other 2. You never know. He also admired a second-hand outboard motor that I brought, which was a way of saying he'd like to buy it, and so I had to sell it cheap. And he then used it out into the bay a little ways, which is salt water, not strong salt water, but salt water, and they didn't flush it out afterwards, and so he had mechanical trouble. And he complained to me. I think he wanted a rebate. I offered to buy it back from him, and he got angry. And I didn't want him to be angry. Anyway, that was the end of the outboard motor. But he was possessive of things. That worked enormously in my favor. And as the repository of traditional knowledge, he was a real contributor. He also sometimes bummed people out of things. Okay? So he's a human being. His wife, Harriet, was wonderful. And my wife then, Sarah, we were married 37 years before cancer took her, made Harriet some embroidered pillowcases while Harriet was doing the webbing on some snowshoes that John was making for me and for Sarah. And so there was a kind of a friendship established there, too. And I remember when she gave Harriet the pillowcases, they were sitting outside on the grass, Harriet lacing snowshoes, and Sarah gave her those and told her they were present. And Harriet sort of bounced up and down with pleasure.